Hello and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach. Today we're going to talk about immigration and immigration policy in the United States. My guest today is Dr. Kevin Wallsten. Dr. Wallsten is an Associate Professor in the Political Science Department. Welcome, Kevin, and thank you for joining us on Talking Points.
Hi, Dave.
Well, we're going to talk about immigration today, but we should probably clarify there are actually three variations of immigration that we're going to talk about. The first one is legal immigration. That is, the immigrants that have legal authorization and documentation to actually reside in the U.S. Second kind is illegal immigration, where immigrants do not have legal authorization or documentation. And then the third area is refugee and asylum status, which relates to people that are fleeing from a war-torn area or some type of very severe political persecution, which if they were to go back to their home country could result in very extreme kinds of imprisonment or possibly even execution. So with that as the starting point, let's first talk about legal immigration, which is how hopefully most of us arrived here, or our ancestors arrived here through legal immigration. We know today we have approximately about 1 million new immigrants that arrive here or are actually certified to stay here under the legal auspices of the government. If we take a look at the year 2011, just pulling those statistics out, we had about 1 million then. Of those 1 million immigrants which became American citizens, about 90,000 were from the combined countries of Europe. The other two areas that were significant were the quote-unquote Americas other than the U.S., which would be Mexico, Canada, and the Caribbean. Those yielded about 423,000 new residents of the U.S., new citizens. And then the final area, Asia, and the influx from Asian countries was about 439,000, so just a little bit more than the Americas. What do those trends tell us about immigration these days?
They tell us a couple things. The first thing they tell us is that the United States is the country of immigration around the world. 1 million is a lot of people. And although the United States is only 5% of the world's population, we're 20% of the world's immigrants. So that's the first thing it tells us. Second thing it tells us is that economic opportunity is the main driver, really, of immigration. Low levels of immigration from European countries is revealing. It suggests that people only leave a country when they lack opportunity or political protections for their lives there. The final thing it tells us is that immigration is a major cause of American diversity. And if we look at this, the fact that a lot of immigrants are currently coming from Asia as well as the Americas suggests that our political rhetoric is a little bit misguided. We typically think in this country of immigration as being a primarily Latino issue. It's not. It's actually an issue that affects a large number of people, and that a large number of people from a lot of different backgrounds actually care deeply about.
Okay, well that's the legal immigration to the United States, which again is roughly around 1 million people per year. Now if we start talking about the illegal immigration, those folks that are not here legally and don't have authorization to be here legally, then we're now talking about somewhere in the ballpark of about 400,000 people per year. Now where are most of those people coming from and how are they entering into the United States?
Yeah, I would start by saying that we've seen a lot of change in the numbers. So it's a little bit hard to pinpoint that there's 400,000 a year that are coming. If we went back to 1997, there were about 6 million unauthorized people living in the United States. In 2007, there were 12 million. So in a 10-year period, we basically doubled. The Great Recession led to a pretty sharp decline in the number of people unauthorized living in the United States. It fell to about 11 million, and it's remained static since then, according to the best reports, although it's obviously really hard to measure and track these things. So the first thing that we know is that immigration fluctuates, and the economy, of course, drives a lot of that fluctuation. There's an old saying in campaigns and elections that it's the economy, stupid, and basically you could say the same thing about immigration as well. We also know that again, it's not strictly an issue of Latino immigration when we think about illegal immigration. About half of the people who are here undocumented are from Mexico. So if we take that 11 million, about half of them are from Mexico, about 3/4 overall from Latin American countries, but it's not strictly an issue of Mexican illegal immigration when we talk about this issue. And I would say one other point here, when we think about undocumented immigrants, is that it's not always people coming across the border. In fact, most people who are here undocumented now arrived here legally, meaning they came in through a port or an airport, they had the appropriate visa, and they decided to stay longer than their visa allowed. So when we think about the traditional conception of immigration, illegal immigration that we get through paying attention to the media and maybe some campaign and election kinds of communication, it can be a little bit mischaracterized as being solely illegal immigration from Mexico, which it's not.
That's not to say that there isn't illegal immigration across the southern border. Clearly, we've seen that on the news many, many times.
Yeah, it's about 40%. So it's a big number. I don't want to downplay the number, but again, I think too often when we think about these things and we debate them politically, we equate illegal immigration with people coming across illegally from the Mexican border.
You were mentioning that the overstay of visas. Mm-hmm. So I think, was the report recently about 500,000 in the past year overstayed their visas?
Yes.
What are the consequences of overstaying a visa?
The consequences vary depending on how long you overstay your visa, and of course whether you're caught overstaying your visa, I guess first and foremost. But the consequences vary with how long you stay. And it can be pretty limited if you stay only a short period of time and becomes more severe. But normally what it is if you overstay your visa, you're prohibited from re-entering the United States for a period of 3 years or 10 years. Now what that has the incentive that creates is if you overstay for more than basically 6 months, you don't want to leave because then you'll be prohibited from entering legally again for probably 10 years. And so it actually creates this system where people have a tendency to stay once they've stayed past their visa for about 6 months.
And when you mentioned the 11 million, that's the figure that is generally agreed upon, about 11 million, and it can vary depending upon the situation. But of those 11 million, some folks have said, well, why don't we just mass deport those 11 million? But it's quite complicated. Most folks that are rational on both sides or on all sides of the spectrum would say, well, it's probably not practical and logistically impossible, not to mention the cost. So what are the complicating factors that would make mass deportation of 11 million people virtually impossible?
The cost issue can't be emphasized enough. It costs about $20,000 to deport somebody. Now, if you just did the math, as some researchers have done, and sort of figured out how long would it take to deport 11 million people and how much money would that cost, we're looking at a 20-year project to deport 11 million people that will cost $500 billion. This is a massive program, the scale of which is unprecedented in human history. So when we talk about actually doing this, it's completely impractical, beyond the scope of anything we've ever seen before. But another important limitation or constraint on this is that it's actually not a popular policy position with the American public. So we have some surveys on this. About 65% of the American public actually wants a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, meaning they want some way for those 11 million people who are currently living in the country to actually become citizens. Only about 15% of the public even supports in the abstract a policy of mass deportation. So one of the main constraints that you face is that it's not a political winner. We have a democracy where people need to get elected to keep their jobs, and basically there's no sane politician who's going to endorse a policy that's going to cost many billions of dollars, take a large number of years, and probably get them voted out of office.
Well, if we take a look at deportation, and what there does seem to be a general consensus about is the fact that criminal activity committed by criminal actions or crimes committed by illegal immigrants would seem to be the first criterion for deportation. Obviously, if people are here and causing trouble, we don't want them around. What about that?
That's true, and if we can't reach a consensus about criminals being deported, then we're lost as a country in this debate. So there's not a lot of disagreement about that. Most people, when you ask them who should be deported, how should priorities be set up, so when we have to deport people, who should be the first, criminals are. Now there is actually a pretty significant, I think, disconnect between serious research examining the effects of immigration on crime rates and how likely it is that people who are in this country actually commit crimes, and our sense from paying attention to the popular debate in the media. Most of the academic research suggests a very weak to negative relationship between immigration and crime, meaning the more immigrants you have, the lower the crime rates. Of course, this is not necessarily consistent with most people's perception of these things, because in fact, these are high-profile crimes. When an immigrant, especially an undocumented immigrant, commits a murder or commits some other horrible crime, it receives a disproportionate amount of media coverage compared to what the same crime would receive if carried out by an American citizen. So there is this little bit of a disconnect that we often see. Opponents of immigration really like to emphasize or highlight crimes committed by undocumented immigrants, but when we look at the sort of broader bird's eye view, what the statistics actually say, there's not a clear relationship between immigration being undocumented or legal immigration and crime rates.
I suppose if you take a look at the crime rate as a whole, that has to be taken into account. I do want to, in the couple minutes we have before the break, mention a study from the Texas Department of Public Safety which indicated that between the years 2008 and 2014, so in about a 6-year span, there were something like 611,000 crimes committed by 178,000 suspects described as, and I'll quote here, unique criminal alien defendants. And among those crimes, there were 3,000 murders and about 7,700 sexual assaults. And that's only in the state of Texas. Of course, Texas is more heavily affected than many other states. Does that kind of statistic or those kinds of statistics have bearing on these political discussions that go on in this country?
It has some bearing on the political discussions, of course, which is opponents of immigration, opponents of immigration reform like to emphasize these kinds of stories because they help, at least in their view, increase opposition to immigration reform. Now, whether it actually matters for the politics of this in terms of what the law looks like, I'm deeply skeptical, because actually the lack of getting any sort of movement on immigration reform is more a story about the American political system and its dysfunction than it is any sort of reasonable response to crime statistics. So I think you'll probably see this more and more as the sort of machinery of government is unable to respond to immigration, and people who on either sides of the issue become frustrated with this. You're going to see more and more attempts to persuade the public, and certainly emphasizing heinous crimes on the part of undocumented immigrants is a good way to try to force action into the political system.
Okay, and on that note, we'll go to the break, and when we come back from the break, we'll talk about the so-called sanctuary cities and also refugee and asylum status for immigration. Stay with us.
What does graphic design look like 20 years from now? Does GIFs, flat design, or ultra minimal aesthetic mean anything to you? How about the idea that language isn't as effective as images, hyperlinks, or perhaps emoticons? Graphic design is changing rapidly. You can become a part of this exciting career field with a degree from Cal State Long Beach.
Hello and welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, and my guest today is Dr. Kevin Wallsten. Kevin, when we left off, we were talking about the impact of statistics related to crime and how that affects the debate politically about immigration. Let's talk now about sanctuary cities and the mere existence of sanctuary cities and whether that seems to fly in the face of compliance with the law and public safety. Why do we have sanctuary cities, and what are the purposes of sanctuary cities?
Well, sanctuary cities are really a collection of policies. They're not all exactly the same. But sanctuary cities are designed in a way to promote public safety for those who actually enact sanctuary city policies. Sanctuary city, just to be clear, sort of is a kind of don't ask, don't tell policy on the part of local governments, where they decide to not collect certain kinds of information about the people that they're arresting and then not share that with the federal government. Now, it can be sort of frustrating, I think, to people who are trying to figure out, well, how is it possible that local governments are able to not collect this information or not share it with federal immigration authorities? And in fact, the policies that are sort of pursued at the federal level are not mandatory. They don't impose any legal requirements on city governments. So cities are actually free to avoid or prohibit the sharing of information with the federal government. In fact, many city and now state governments are saying that the federal government should be in charge of immigration enforcement. When we're arresting people and then turning them over to the federal government, we're doing the federal government's job for them on our own dime. So really, the sanctuary city policies are designed to save local money in a lot of senses, to say we're not going to invest our limited law enforcement resources sort of, pursuing federal law violations, as immigration violations are, and they're designed to actually encourage cooperation with local populations who may or may not be undocumented immigrants.
It does seem like whenever there's a high-profile crime like the Kate Steinle event in San Francisco, where she was murdered by an illegal immigrant who actually had several low-level criminal offenses, this makes big headlines.
Big headlines. Again, because the immigration issue is an issue that people care greatly about. They care deeply about it. And certainly for opponents of immigration, this becomes a way to actually, again, try to get the political system moving in the direction that they want it to move in. The American political system, in many senses, is broken, and action doesn't seem to come easily. And so when you get horrific tragedies like this, there's always an incentive for people who want to push for government action to really highlight them. And this horrible tragedy is another example of that.
In 1986, President Ronald Reagan signed what was then called the Immigration Reform and Control Act. A lot of people today refer to it as the Amnesty Act of 1986, because it did, in fact, provide amnesty for approximately 3 million folks that were living in America illegally. We found out later that almost 25% of those applications involved some level of fraud, which is a little disturbing, but nonetheless, that law was supposed to, quote-unquote, take care of the problem with illegal immigration, and obviously it did not. We're now looking at 11 million people that would prefer to have some sort of amnesty or some variation of it. Why didn't the amnesty, or excuse me, I called it the Amnesty Act, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, take care of the problem as President Reagan had designed?
Well, first of all, it didn't deal fully with amnesty. It said you had to be in the country pre-1982 to actually get amnesty, which left about 2 million people in this weird sort of gray area where they couldn't qualify for the amnesty. And you just still had this group of people. What is to be done with them? But more importantly, what the bill did not do is it did not take seriously the demand for labor that's provided by undocumented immigrants. What it did is it created some sort of border enforcement mechanism that was incredibly poorly funded, and then it created a very, very poorly enforced employment verification kind of system, where it said if you're an employer and you're going to hire somebody, you have to check their paperwork, but don't look too deeply into it. Don't stare too hard at it. And if you're caught violating the law, meaning you're hiring an undocumented immigrant, there'll be almost no punishment. Now, of course, when you have this situation where the law doesn't allow for more legal immigration to satisfy labor demand, and there's no penalty associated with actually hiring undocumented people, and there's no border enforcement, what you're going to get is you're going to get 11 million people coming over the border to work undocumented.
All right, well, if we take a look at the history of immigration law in the United States, back in the 1920s, we had the Immigration Quota Act. What was the Quota Act and what was the purpose of that kind of policy?
Yeah, the Quota Act was designed to essentially lock into place the ethnic and cultural homogeneity of the United States. We have to go back basically to the start of the 20th century to really understand what's going on here. We had a raw number of immigrants coming to the country that's roughly the same as what we have today, about 1.2 million people coming to the country. There was a lot of concern that this new wave of immigrants was going to fundamentally alter the ethnic and racial and cultural composition of the United States to the country's detriment. So there was an attempt to legislate a certain kind of country and limit immigration. So what it did is it went back in time. It said, we're going to strictly cap immigration to about 150,000 a year, and what's more, we're going to limit where those people can come from. And what it had the effect of doing was placing a large sort of limitation on people from Southern and Eastern Europe. Interestingly, what it did not do was regulate immigration from the Americas, from Mexico and Latin America. That wouldn't happen until the 1960s. But really the target of the 1920 reforms were to solidify the exclusion of Asians and limit immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe.
And then when we move ahead about 45 years or so, in 1965, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Immigration and Naturalization Act, part of the civil rights movement at that time. What was this new act in 1965 all about?
It was all about basically a symbolic gesture. It happens right between the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And it was largely seen to be a symbolic gesture, not one that would dramatically change the composition of the United States in any way. Ted Kennedy very famously said, look, we're not going to have 1 million immigrants in our cities every year if we pass this law, and that's exactly what has happened. So what this law did is it sort of took that 1920 law, its set of discriminatory quotas, and wiped them off the book. It said every country will be treated the same for purposes of immigration. We're going to give, for instance, every country around the world 20,000 visas. The other thing that it did that was very interesting and very profound for our country is it established a system where visas would be given primarily on the basis of family reunification concerns, not skill-based economic kinds of considerations. So the 1965 law sort of cements this notion that the primary goal of an immigration system in the United States should be family reunification, not sort of economic priorities.
There was a skill set provision in that law in addition to family reunification. And what was the skill set aspect of the law for new immigrants, and how did that skew the population and the population mix for Asians that immigrated?
Yeah, it's really interesting because if you go back in American history, beginning in the 1880s, all the way up until basically the 1960s, Asians were prohibited from immigrating to the United States. Now in 1965, the law is passed that wipes that off the books, that finally gives this certain number of visas to people from around the world, regardless of country. Now, the priority is given to reunifying families. So most of the visas are eaten up by family connections from other countries. But because there were essentially no Asian Americans living in the country pre-1965, all of the visas from China, from Japan, from Korea are given to professionals. They're given to doctors and scientists and people with advanced degrees. Now, of course, when you stack the deck in that way, what you're going to get is you're going to get a group of people who take education very seriously, have higher socioeconomic status, and that will be reflected in the sort of priorities they give to their children. And so we typically think of Asian Americans as an overachieving group academically, very high in socioeconomic status, and that's certainly true, but rather than attributing that to any sort of innate ability or some sort of cultural advantage, really it's an artifact of this set of laws from the 1880s to the 1960s.
Okay, well, let's talk about refugee and asylum status. And we know that currently there's a big debate going on about what to do about the refugees from the war in Syria and Iraq. And we know that a lot of people are being chased out of their homelands. We know that ISIS has been turned loose. by circumstances in the Middle East. What do we do about these refugees? ISIS has taunted the U.S. and other Western countries saying, okay, take in the refugees if you like, but we're going to infiltrate it with our own group of terrorists. So we have this legitimate tension between wanting to be compassionate, yet wanting to be prudent and not allowing a big problem to develop here from terrorists getting in with a free pass. What about that?
I couldn't say it better myself in a way. There's a legitimate tension here. Now, refugees are sort of a distinct part of our legal immigration system. Congress and the President get to decide how much we're going to actually let in terms of refugees each year, and it's about 80,000. Now, refugees have to go through an extensive process. The process of vetting somebody who's a refugee is far more thorough and detailed than the process of coming over through the normal channels of legal immigration. So refugee status, in a way, is kind of less threatening, I think, in terms of worrying about security concerns than just normal immigration, or certainly immigration that happens illegally through one of our borders. We actually go to great lengths to investigate the backgrounds of people who are applying for refugee status, both in order to ensure that they have a legitimate cause for claiming refugee status, but also to make sure they're not a security concern. We're actually pretty good at this. If you look at the numbers since 9/11, we've had about 800,000 refugees come to the country. Only 3 of those people have actually ever been arrested for any sort of threat to national security. So we seem to be pretty good about it, but there's always that threat that we have to take very seriously, and that can be difficult when we're faced with large numbers of applicants who want refugee status.
We only have about 30 seconds left. Let's talk about assimilation. Putting it all together in 30 seconds or less, what does the future look like in terms of policy changes and voter patterns based on the fact that we now have something like 42 million folks living in the U.S., about 13.3%, if I remember correctly, that are immigrants?
Yeah. Immigrants tend to be, on the whole, more liberal in their policy preferences, and what we've seen is they're more likely to vote Democratic. So to the extent that immigration changes the composition of the country, that seems like it's going to favor the Democrats over the Republicans. And certainly this is something that the Republicans are aware of. It's part of their opposition to increasing levels of immigration. But I just will say that we're always really bad at predicting the future, as it turns out, and just because that's the way things look now, it doesn't mean that they'll look that way in 10 or 20 years.
And on that note, we've got to come to an end on this program, but thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you, Dave.
And thank you for joining us on this edition of Talking Points. Join us again soon for another episode. Until then, I'm Dave Kelly. Have a nice day.